Afternoon, everyone. I'm not sure I need to preach about worship after that, to be honest. We could end the service a lot sooner. That's fantastic. Thank you. Okay, so today's reading is Romans 12, and we're doing chapter 12, verses 1 to 2, and that's on page 1139 of your table Bibles. Therefore, I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship. Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing and perfect will. This is the word of the Lord. Okay, so afternoon everyone. So those that don't know me, my name's Richard. I'm a member of here of Oak Tree, and I usually perch in the children's section with a couple of T-Rexes, just keeping me guard, keeping me safe. But those of you that know me will know that I do quite enjoy my sport, and being a Yorkshireman, it was obviously destiny to be a cricketer. It's just in the blood. So I threw myself into playing the game whenever I could. And as a boy, I eventually made it into the school team, aged 11. And I've been waiting ages to make my debut. And I was practising back garden, uncovered wickets. None of this covered wickets nonsense you get nowadays. I got my Jeff Boycott's Guide to Batting. That had some very nice flick animation pictures that told you how to do different strokes. And my forward defensive was, I thought, quite impressive. But the day of my debut arrived. And I was fifth man in. Or fifth boy in, age 11. And I'll be honest, I started to get quite nervous. Wickets started to tumble. Fourth man went down. It was my turn. Now, those of you that like cricket will know that usually the batsman walks nice and slowly to the crease, has a bit of a chat with his teammate, works out what to do, and then takes it from there. But not me. My nerves got the better of me, and I went charging towards the crease, running as fast as I could run, shouting out tactics to my teammate. it was a sight to behold. So I got into the crease, asked the umpire for mid and off. Middle and off. That's it. Middle off stump. Stuck up guard. Bowler comes running in. Really nice delivery. I could see it just going over the boundary rope for four. First shot. Closed my eyes. Swung the bat. And then just heard the noise of the ball hitting the stumps, the bails hitting the deck, and that was it. That was my debut, and I sloped off the pitch, golden duck. It was really awful. Heartbroken I was. I heard some hours of sympathy, so thank you very much. And I promise you there is a link to today's reading. So I threw myself into learning to play cricket, and really was desperate to play. Unfortunately. I had a bit of a cricketing failure. But I think what we see in the reading today is Paul urging us to give ourselves as a living sacrifice to God. And actually, for my cricketing failure, what we ultimately see in throwing ourselves into God is God's presence and spiritual blessing. So this is the second session looking at worship. We're doing a series of storylines, themes that echo from Old Testament to New Testament, and through to our future when Jesus returns. And this is the second looking at worship. And last week we heard about the Shema. He says, looking to Vicar. Have I got this right? Brilliant. So pronounce it Shema. So that was something that Tim told us runs through Israel like the word Blackpool through a stick of rock. And God's command to the Israelites was to love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your mind and all your strength. And Tim linked that then to the reading in the New Testament where Jesus kind of was asked what the greatest commandments were and said it's that one. And it's actually to love your neighbour as yourself. And Tim asked us to reflect on how possible is it to love our neighbour as ourselves if we don't perhaps love ourselves particularly well. And that really spoke to me, I'll be honest, as I went through this week. And I just want to explore about how worshipping God can help us receive that restoration that God has in store for us. Because worship is actually a two-way thing. And I certainly kind of felt it in that worship slot, which is why I kind of thought, do I need to speak or not? But I will do, otherwise we'll be finishing very early. So we don't just sing songs or worship to please God. It's not something that God expects us to do just because he likes to hear it. It's to remind ourselves of who he is and what he's done for his people and what he's going to continue to do for us. And in doing this, he will further bless and restore us. And if we're restored, I think we're going to be then more able to perhaps love ourselves and do things and carry out his will and love our neighbour as much as ourselves. So just to start to unpack that in a bit more detail, first of all, we're going to do a bit of a quick tour about how worship was important to Israel, so building on what we heard last week, and then how worship was important to Jesus and what it was in his life, and then how we can apply it to ourselves. So starting in the early days, we see right back in Genesis, right in the beginning, Adam and Eve were in constant relationship with God. So they were there in the Garden of Eden with God, and a key part of that relationship with him was worship. And God designed us to be in constant relationship with him. But unfortunately, our free will got the better of that. And Adam and Eve had other ideas, ate the apple from the tree. The only thing that God had asked them not to do. But the key point of that is actually what Adam and Eve were doing was worshipping creation and not God. So they were looking to the things of creation and not the things of God. And just as we are, the people of Israel were post-Eden people. So they were in the world and of the world, and they just couldn't help themselves focusing on things of creation. So even when Moses was up the mountain talking to God, you think his people would be like, whoa, he's up there talking to God, that's amazing. They were actually down below, busy creating a golden calf. So they were wanting to create something else that they were going to worship and idolise. And as we heard last week, to help with that, the people of Israel received a command from God. So their law was to love the Lord your God with all your heart, and all your minds, and all your strength. And so the people of Israel would actually fulfill that by sacrificing things of creation. So they burnt grain, they destroyed cattle, in a way just to show God, actually, this isn't important to us. What's important to us is you. And they understood their imperfection, and the law was there to try and help them focus on what they were there for, and that God had wanted a relationship with them. But the important thing there wasn't that they were breaking the law when they sought and worshipped creation, but actually it broke that relationship. So all through the creation story for us was to be in a relationship with God, and actually in breaking the law they were breaking relationship. And in the New Testament and in Jesus' life, God offered us a new way of looking at this, as with many things. So God was searching the earth, I like to think, for one human being who could offer him perfect worship, because the people of Israel were always looking elsewhere. They would keep coming back, thanks to God, but actually in the heart they kept looking elsewhere. And he couldn't find one until Jesus. And actually we see in Hebrews 10 verse 12, Jesus' work described as for all time one sacrifice for sins. So we've heard that Israel, part of their worship, or sacrifice was part of their worship in their life. So this one-time perfect sacrifice from Jesus was actually a one-time perfect worship. And Jesus loved God perfectly and completely, and he expressed it in the way he lived his life. So he was motivated to please his Father. And in John 4:34, Jesus said, "My food is to do the will of him who sent me and to finish his work." So Jesus was the only human being in all history who loved God with all his heart, all his soul and all his strength. He was fulfilling the law in his life. His love and his worship was perfect. And he lived in perfect obedience to God, which is why when it came to the ultimate sacrifice on the cross, when he died for us, it was the one perfect sacrifice. So Jesus didn't just choose God over tokens of worship. He actually chose God over life itself. And every moment of Jesus' life and his death was an act of worship to God, designed to bring about God's creation, kingdom and will to his creation. So we've got a choice, I think, in that is how do we respond to that? And I don't know about you, but I often can feel quite bad about it, that actually how imperfect I am and focus on my own imperfections. Or actually what I often have to choose to do is to focus on what that must have taken God to send his only son to die for us. And so we have that relationship with God restored thanks to Jesus' life. So what we then need to look at is, what does this mean today to our worship? And do we need to sacrifice? Well, no, we don't come up here and kind of, burn a few things or set fire to things. Because Jesus was that once for all sacrifice. But that said, sacrifice is still, I think, an important part, and there is a place for it. But what should that be? Should it be my iPod or my phone? That'd be quite difficult, I think, actually. Could I sacrifice my phone? But actually, what Paul asks us to do in the reading today is sacrifice even more than that. It's about giving our lives as a sacrifice. So just to go over that key sentence again. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. So I think sometimes we can make a mistake of thinking that worship is just singing some songs here on a Sunday. And I think there's times in my spiritual life when I've just sung rather than actually lived it and thrown myself into it. But I think the echo from the past, so just as we heard last week, Israel had the word worship cut through them like a stick of rock. Actually, it's about us living our lives in that way. It was a reminder for Israel of who God was in the law and how he helped them focus on him and what God was for, not the things of creation. And for Jesus, we've seen that was all of his life. So in the New Testament, when you look at the words that are used for worship, one is latreia, and that means to serve. And another one, and this is the tricky one, the internet told me how to say it, so we'll be all right. Proskuneo. Maybe right. So, but the key thing is, though, that one means to come towards, to kiss. So both of those words are active things. They are not passive things. So in the Bible, worship is a physical activity. It rarely involves just sitting still and perhaps just moving your mouth. In the Bible, it involves singing, clapping, dancing, lifting your eyes, lifting your head, standing, kneeling, falling down, even wearing sackcloth and ashes, which thankfully we don't do very often. But you can see it was an active thing. And it was a specific act of devotion as well. So whilst the reading says about giving your whole life, for me, I've often found that it was difficult. What does that mean? Is it every minute of every living day? Well, yes, it should be. But actually, I think what we need to focus on is there are specific acts of devotion that will help us do that. And I think the sung worship we do here on a Sunday, so the worship we've just done, is a specific act of devotion. It isn't just singing, it's putting all of ourselves into worshipping him. And this too is something that echoes through the Bible. So, Old Testament, the Bible repeatedly says they worshipped of Israel. So 2 Chronicles chapter 7, Solomon dedicating the temple. They built it to kind of house, well, I'll talk to you a bit more in a minute about why they built it, but anyway, to house, but trying to house God and make sure his presence was there on earth. But it says in verse 3 that they worshipped. And that involved the sacrifice of 22,000 cattle, 120,000 sheep and goats, but it also involves singing. So a lot of slaughter, but let's focus on the singing. And they were singing, he is good and his love endures forever. So they were singing over and over again the things that they knew God was to them. And one of the very first examples of singing in the Bible, Exodus 15, so Israel had just escaped from slavery. They'd escaped from Egypt, escaped across the Red Sea. And Moses, Miriam and all the Israelites were singing and dancing. And there were tambourines. I don't get enough. I'm sure we must have some in the back. We don't see enough tambourines, but anyway. But that example showed that worship and restoration go hand in hand. And there's plenty of other examples. So it wasn't just low points. So during the high point of the dedication of the temple that they'd built, Israel worshipped God through song. And in a minute we'll see what the outcome of that was and what happened following that. But the Psalms also, full of commands of encouragement. So just one example, Psalm 81, verse 1-2. Sing for joy to God our strength. Shout aloud to the God of Jacob. Begin the music. Strike the tambourine. Tambourines again. And play the melodious harp and lyre. The Psalms are full of commands like this. And singing is active worship. And there's meant to be an element of celebration for us. Now, the New Testament, moving on to what that may show us about worship, doesn't give us any specific blueprints. So there's no instructions about the sound levels. So that's why today Peter's up there. It's very important we have somebody to help do that because the Bible doesn't tell us what the level is going to be. Ephesians 5, though, does give us some clue about worship. It says, do not get drunk on wine, which leads to debauchery. Instead, be filled with the Spirit, speaking to one another with psalms, hymns and songs from the Spirit. Sing and make music from your heart to the Lord, always giving thanks to God the Father for everything, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. So it echoes the Old Testament, that reading, I think, where it says that we're to sing and make music in our hearts as well as with our lips. And we're motivated to respond like that, I think, personally, for me, when I'm reminded of the gratitude and awe for what God has done for us. And ultimately, in the New Testament, the grandest vision of worship, I think, is in Revelation. Revelation paints a picture of a huge kind of worship gathering. So it's like new wine times 10, or no, even more than that, times like 1,000,000 probably. In Revelation, it is with 10,000 times 10,000 angels. And Revelation 5:6 says specifically, "Then I saw a lamb looking as if it had been slain, standing at the centre of the throne, encircled by the 4 living creatures and elders. The lamb had 7 horns and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God sent out to all the earth." The key point of that reading, I think, for me, is it points to what they were worshipping for. So they were worshipping to the lamb, they were worshipping to Jesus. So actually, if our worship isn't about Jesus, then it can just be a lot of noise. So worship in the New Testament, I think, shows us about specific acts of devotion. It's important for us, if we're able to start giving our lives, I think for me, specific acts of devotion help me do that and help us do that. But as I said at the start, that's just not because God likes to hear it. It's actually he uses that and takes that. It's a two-way thing. He responds to us in our worship. So we worship as a response to God's presence in our lives. But as a response to that worship, we also get to experience his continued presence. And all through the Bible, there's examples of that, about how God responds. So again, Old Testament, 2 Chronicles 5:12-14. So the temple had been dedicated to God. The people just longed for God's presence, so they built a temple to reflect that. And the people worshipped, and God's presence fell on them. So it says in that reading, "All the Levites who were musicians, Asaph, Heman, Jeduthun, and their sons and relatives, stood on the east side of the altar, dressed in fine linen and playing cymbals, harps and lyres. They were accompanied by 120 priests sounding trumpets. The trumpeters and musicians joined in unison to give praise and thanks to the Lord. Accompanied by trumpets, cymbals, and other instruments, the singers raised their voices in praise to the Lord and sang, 'He is good, and his love endures forever.' Then the temple of the Lord was filled with the cloud, and the priests could not perform their service because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled the temple of God." So in giving that worship to God, God's presence fell on them, and they couldn't carry on with what they were thinking they were expecting to do. And we find many similar stories in the Old Testament. So Joshua, Battle of Jericho. I used to love that song at school, even though I wasn't a Christian. It was brilliant anyway. But God had told Joshua they were going to win. The victory was won. But what he needed to do was march around the city blowing horns with the priests up front. And I think it's fair to say that for me, I saw that as certainly as a form of worship. And once they walked around, they shouted and the walls fell down. So they worshipped and the presence of God fell. It also continues into the New Testament. So again, Acts 16. Paul and Silas in the dungeon of a prison after being arrested for preaching the good news of Jesus. And it says, at about midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the other prisoners were listening to them. Suddenly, there was a violent earthquake, such a violent earthquake that the foundations of the prison were shaken. At once, all the prison doors flew open, and everyone's chains came loose. Now, they'd been kind of flogged, stripped, beaten, everything else. And at a time when I'd probably have been feeling quite sorry for myself, they were actually there worshipping God. And the result of that was God's presence coming upon them, and a very physical release and restoration followed for them. So the thing is that that's on offer to us too today. Those that know me know I've had an interesting, no, it's not been interesting, it's just been really difficult last year, 18 months. My mum was ill and then unfortunately died quite suddenly last December. And I've been going up to see her every kind of fortnight in Sheffield, and I'll be honest, I was physically and emotionally absolutely exhausted, and it had taken quite a toll on me. So I kind of still knew that God was there for me, but I'll probably just come along and sing a bit of a song rather than actually mean it, and put my all into it. And I would pray, and I was just getting more and more physically exhausted because I was of the world, and I'd always sought my own solutions to how I was feeling and trying to get over that. I thought, I just need to buckle down. It's just grief. It will be fine. Don't worry. It'll just be a bit hard for a bit, and it will get better. But I'll be honest, it wasn't, and I was getting worse. And it was fantastic knowing that I got so many Oaks and family members as well praying for me, and I really valued that. But I still felt knackered. I still felt exhausted, and I was struggling. But during the worship here at Oak Tree, Ruth Robinson was really throwing herself, as ever, into worship. And thankfully for me, I got given a picture by God, and she passed it on to me after the service, and it really spoke to me. So the picture was of me carrying a rucksack full of rocks, and I was trying to carry the rucksack, but I was really struggling. And Ruth said God was telling me to put the bag down, and I'll tell you, I couldn't. So at first I was trying to bargain. I was kind of going, come on God, you don't mean put the bag down, you mean just walk a bit more slowly, carry it a bit like this, it'll be fine, don't worry. Because to be honest, being in and of the world, I often saw a lot of my identity in being able to be seen as trying to hold it together and being able to do well at work and all that other stuff. But actually I was really struggling with holding down a job and trying to be a father and a husband. And I realised I needed to put the bag down, and that was really difficult. So I had to go to work and basically go, I need to not be here for a while, which was a very difficult thing to do. And I felt really weak and struggled to do that. But it was absolutely the right thing to do. I kind of had time away and was able to focus on the things that were important to me. So actually truly seek time with God and spend time with my family. And I'll tell you what, I feel restored. There's still work to do, don't get me wrong, but I feel restored in a way that was just so different to how I was. So 6 months ago, I could not have stood up in front of you all. I just was not in a place to be able to do that. But thanks to Ruth and a fellow Christian throwing themselves into worship with God, God has kind of blessed me as a result, and I feel quite humble about that. But for me, I just wanted to give that example as a bit of a story about, I think, what worship's there to do. It is very much a two-way thing. It's there for us all today. So I think to sum up where we are with the worship storyline, we were made to live in that relationship with God. And we were created to be with him and to worship him. But we've chosen to do other things at times. But he's broken through that. He sent his son to reclaim that relationship for us. And through that, he offers us restoration today. So I think, for me, the message I guess I'd say is, worship is brilliant. And I think those of us going to New Wine, use that time to go away when you get to worship with thousands of other people, like you don't often get to do that, and really throw yourselves into it. And to Oak Stone in Acton, I'd say throw yourselves into the worship here, because God's here as much as he is in a field in Shepton Mallet. So don't miss out on those opportunities. And as ever, I always love to try and finish on a quote, and I got two, so it's 2 for 1 today. First is American pastor A.W. Tozer, who said, "Without worship, we go about miserable." And the reason for that, as I hope we've heard today, is summed up in another quote from author C.S. Lewis. He said, "It is in the process of being worshipped that God communicates his presence to men." So what I'll do now, I'll just end with a short prayer, but there'll be a time for some prayer ministry, I think, after communion. So we're going to go into a time of communion after prayer, and then we'll be offering up some prayer ministry in the corner over there, if anyone's feeling particularly like today's sermon or worship has spoken to them. Father God, thank you for the gift of worship, and that through that you let your presence be truly known to your people. I pray, Lord, that we embrace the worship opportunities in the coming weeks, wherever they be, and actively offer ourselves, Lord, and throw ourselves into those, so that as a result we can again experience more of your presence and restoration. In Jesus' name, amen.